bringing you the crisp latest and trending news for our economic enthusiasts like always, brought to you by none other than Monash University. So today, for our episode number 9, we're talking about something which is more valuable than food and more expensive than gold. Any guesses? Yup, that's it. You want to know how? Stick with Junaid and Sasha till the end to know the story behind this unexpected twist.
The air that's all around us, essential for our very sustenance, became the highest needful asset to every human being with a rising price tag every second in the very well known pandemic. The spread of COVID in the year 2019 created worldwide panic. As people rushed to shelter, no one knew oxygen was the way out. COVID, a fatal virus that hit near 50 million people with 1.5 million deaths in just 10 months, were now left with no remedy known until medical oxygen became an only hope for survival.
The era experience was termed as the Battle of Breath. States like Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Haryana were the first to face the shortage of oxygen. Smaller hospitals and nursing homes in Delhi hit next. Desperate relatives in several cities were lining up outside oxygen filling centers. Manufacturers had to hire bouncers to manage the crowd. While hospitals were struggling and many patients died waiting for it, social media feeds, WhatsApp groups were all full of frantic pleas for oxygen cylinders. For more than 2 weeks, India was living the nightmare on repeat. So, Junaid, tell me about the rising demand for oxygen in India.
Well, in the month of April, post global lockdowns, India faced scarcity in the supply of oxygen required to treat patients. COVID 19 filled the hospitals of India with patients struggling with a severe lack of resources, the worst being oxygen. And talking about demand, the demand of oxygen, which was earlier nearly 700 TPD, rose to 2500 in the first year across the whole country. As COVID 19 also affected the respiratory system of the patients, ended up leading people on ventilators. Eventually, the number of COVID cases went as high as 4 lakhs a day, which is a huge number of patients to cater for. These patients required oxygen cylinders, and there was an acute shortage. India was adding about 90,000 cases daily. A single day spike was around 144,000 patients with a daily caseload of 300,000. There were no ventilators left to suffice for the patients as the number increased. The demand was rising along with the cases, outstripping supply. It shows no signs of letting up. Then you know what happened due to that, right?
Yeah, the medical oxygen cylinders were being sold for as high as 2 lakh rupees or roughly 11,000 ringgit a cylinder, even being sold in black. India has reported more than 400,000 COVID deaths so far.
Okay, so how much did the patient require?
10 liters a minute was required per patient, creating a very high demand for oxygen. But not every patient needs the same amount of oxygen for the same duration. The doctors were startled. This was never in their books. We are all taking care, but I haven't seen anything like this. I think no one has, said Dr. Om Srivastav, an infectious disease expert. Media was all over the place talking about this.
Desperate for oxygen, fighting to keep patients alive. India has the worst COVID outbreak in the world. More than 20 million cases, over 225,000 dead. And now, some experts estimate millions are infected every day.
We could have shut down any time.
Crisis in India piled up huge new numbers again, passing 200,000 deaths overall.
On Tuesday alone, India's official death toll spiked at almost 3,300, its deadliest day.
The shortage of oxygen in the hospital.
The situation is horrific, absolutely terrible. Everyone is afraid, every single person.
India is now staring at an abyss with new infections per day crossing 3 lakhs, a world record.
I'm buying oxygen at the rate of gold.
The doctor, we were the hospital, we are supposed to give life. If we cannot give them oxygen even.
Spread as the second wave hit.
We were not prepared. As a country, we were not prepared. Authorities are scrambling to supply enough medical oxygen as the latest wave of coronavirus infection stretches hospitals to breaking point.
I got a SOS message from one of the doctors at GMC, the Goa Medical College. She reported that she had no oxygen coming in the central pipeline of her ward.
That night, at least 20 people died due to lack of oxygen.
The next day, the issue blew up on social media.
In September 2020, Indian government increased supply to 40% in the first year, which was higher than what was supplied earlier. Medical oxygen was imported from various countries like Germany, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and also the United States. The scramble to find supply in India in the southern state of Kerala increased supply by monitoring demands closely and planning for the rise in cases, whereas Delhi and the other states were either having their own oxygen plants or relying on the imports. Then the Supreme Court had to weigh in, asking the Prime Minister Modi's administration for a national COVID plan that addresses the oxygen crunch. The Federal Health Ministry had invited bids for the oxygen plants in October. Of 162 sanctioned, only 33 were installed so far. 59 were to be installed in the year and 80 by the next year end.
Additional tankers were airlifted from abroad. Tankers used to carry liquid argon and nitrogen were now converted to carry oxygen, and the railways introduced special oxygen express trains. Industrial oxygen was diverted from steel plants to hospitals, and the procurement and distribution of oxygen concentrators was stepped up. Only a few hospitals had in-house facilities to produce this precious gas, most dependent on the oxygen cylinders or liquid medical oxygen that was delivered from elsewhere. What's more, the number of cryogenic tankers needed to transport this oxygen were too few to cope with a sudden spike in demand.
Top oxygen manufacturing firms were struggling to get oxygen from eastern India, where supply in states such as Orissa and Jharkhand was high compared to Maharashtra and Delhi, where cases were rising fast. The demand for oxygen in individual facilities was unpredictable, making it difficult to gauge the requirement as per needed.
And that's just about year one. In the year two, firms like Praxair, Novair, Inox, and also other new set-up oxygen plants increased oxygen supply to 60%, whereas demand was reduced due to vaccination drives. Gearing up for the next oxygen emergency, the government responded in several ways. Companies ranging from steelmakers to refineries, also the logistics firms, are extending a helping hand to the retooling process to provide oxygen for the sick or transporting medical oxygen supplies as the oxygen dwindle. While Jindal Steel and Power, also Vedanta Group, have volunteered to supply oxygen from plants, all cargo logistics have offered to ship 500 oxygen concentrators from Singapore to Maharashtra as the COVID pandemic rages. India's healthcare system joins hands to help critically sick people failing to secure treatment. To talk about this, we have a guest speaker, Sani Ansari, the VP of Nova Air, one of the leading oxygen manufacturing firms. So, Sanya, our listeners would like to know what was the situation like in Nova Air due to the sudden high demand of oxygen?
To be honest, it was unexpected for all of us. We had orders of oxygen from various distributors, hospitals, and also by the government on urgent basis overnight.
How did Nova Air cope with the rising demand?
The pre-COVID demand for liquid medical oxygen was 700 tons per day, which was increased to at least 2000 TPD by running the plant 2 shifts per location.
So, isn't it true that Nova Air Bokaro was the most performing plant for this?
Yes, until we increased manpower and production at Chennai plant, which fortunately was put in action in 2019.
Did your existing plants suffice the demand?
No, we had to take over some micro production TPD plants as third party to fill the demands.
Once production was set as per demand, what was the production at?
It crossed more than 160% of what we used to produce pre-COVID, crossing more than 5,000 TPD.
But I'm sure the invention of the vaccine must have had an impact.
That's a nice question. Yes, it did.
Also, we would like to know what were the steps taken by Nova Air to keep the supply running post vaccination drives?
As the supply of vaccination couldn't reach patients in other countries, that quick we made sure our oxygen is exported and distributed and supplied to patients worldwide until we meet the demand of back in India in the lowering cases.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Sanya. It was great to have you on board with us.
Thank you so much, Junaid and Sashya, for having me over.
So far, we have seen three shifts in the supply and demand of oxygen during the pandemic. First, the demand increased due to the rising cases, and the supply couldn't fill the demand, causing severe repercussions across the globe.
2. The supply increasing due to thrift and adept nature of the industry as well as the efforts of the government and other major organizations.
And the third, the demand decreased due to the reduced cases and vaccination drives, and India started exporting liquid medical oxygen outside the country. Now, India is one of the leading exporters of liquid medical oxygen in the world. Now we know what role oxygen played during the times of pandemic and how the demand was sufficed.
I hope we've conveyed the tale of the supply and demand of oxygen during COVID-19 to our listeners. So stay tuned for our new episode next week with more exciting Indie Biz news.
Go Corona! Go Corona! Corona go! Corona go! Go Corona! Go Corona! Go Corona! Go Corona!